Welcome back, folks. So Microsoft has been releasing a lot of new features for Copilot Studio lately. Just in the last few weeks, we've probably got a dozen or more new features, and there's a lot to be excited about. But today I wanted to talk to you about one that has caught a lot of attention, and that is agent flows. Now, the name might sound something familiar because you've had agents and you've had flows and so on, and you wouldn't be wrong. Basically, the idea behind agent flows is that instead of using Power Automate flows, you would be able to use flows right from within Copilot Studio. So for anybody who doesn't remember how flows work in in Copilot Studio, let's do a real quick primer. So I've got my screen up over here. I'm in Copilot Studio, and if I wanted to connect or if I wanted to use a flow, and why would I often need a flow? It's when my action connectors themselves are insufficient. So for, again, I guess a related primer, typically when you're using an action, you would call one of the Power Automate connectors. So if you were trying to connect to, say, Dynamics 365 and one of the Dynamics 365 connectors that you were looking for, or in this case, let's just stick with Business Central for a second. If you wanted the Create Record connector, you would go look at that. But what you would not get is a series of steps that would follow that connector. You're simply working with that connector. You would send some information and get some information back, etc. With a full-on Power Automate flow, what you would always have is the benefit of an entire flow, a designer canvas where you could take some data, connect it to something, do something with that data, have some conditional workflows, and then eventually return some information back into Copilot Studio. So in this example, if I wanted to use a Power Automate flow, I would come over here and click on New Power Automate Flow, and what that would do is it would jump me into a Power Automate Maker environment, and it would start off with kind of a starting trigger and an ending action. My starting trigger would be when an agent calls a flow, and I can define some inputs, do some things with it, and then eventually respond something back to the agent that it could make sense of. And so that was the experience. So you were jumping from Copilot Studio into Power Automate flows. And that by itself is a little clumsy, if you will, right? Not always the most elegant way of doing things. And as a reminder, too, you could have done the exact same thing, or you were able to do the exact same thing with topics, where a topic could call a Power Automate flow. What Microsoft has now done is given you the ability to go in Copilot Studio and go to flows and here design your own flows. Really, this works very much like Power Automate flows do. You could either describe to build your flow, or you could create a new agent flow. Now, in the interest of time, I've already built one, and I wanted to create a very simple scenario, just kind of demonstrate the capabilities, and I'm not really looking to do any heavy-duty handling with my flow over here. But just by looking at the overview, this is going to look very familiar to some of the things that you have in Power Automate flows. So I have this screen. Let's jump into Power Automate, for instance, and let's look at a flow that I have in Power Automate. So if I were to look at it, very similar overview screen that I've got, some information going here and there. One thing you will notice a little bit, if you look closely, that is that the plan in Power Automate for flows is typically the user who runs the flow. So to tie down to your Power Automate premium license or whatever license you have for Power Automate. Whereas in Copilot Studio, whatever agent flows that you create are going to run against your Copilot Studio plan, whether you have a prepaid plan or you have a pay-as-you-go plan. And the billing consumption rates are defined in the Copilot Studio billing consumption rates learn document. So if you were to go to that document, if you've not looked at this document recently, at least not since February, I recommend you go back and check it, because Microsoft had released a massive update to consumption rates around the February timeline in 2025, and that got a lot of blowback, I think. So they did come back and revise the rates and made them a little bit more lower, a little bit more palatable. So agent flows, when you create them for every 100 actions that these agent flow actions are called, you're going to have 13 messages that are consumed. So just armed with that information, let's go back into Copilot Studio and look at this particular flow that we've created. Right over here, I can also see any historical run data, any information about it. And in Designer, I've got my full canvas. And really, if I scroll up, you'll notice it says, Welcome to Copilot and Power Automate. So really, Microsoft has taken that Power Automate experience, lifted it, and dropped it inside of Copilot Studio. And it will typically always start with when an agent calls a flow, and then you can decide what your other actions are. So I've got one action here where I'm taking basically two words, word one and word one is two as my inputs, and I'm running a little PowerFX function where I can concatenate the word one and word two. So this is very similar, again, how you can create an expression with Copilot or type in your expressions from either functions or dynamic content that you have or some combination of them both. And then eventually I chose to respond back to that agent with a output called combined words. And so it returns a concatenated word. Now, a couple of things I want to highlight in this experience. Number one, when you're trying to name your flow, you won't be able to click it and name it. You have to go back to, like something else accidentally. You'll have to click on Overview and Edit and then rename the flow that you've got over here. That is one thing. The second I've noticed is that I cannot test my flow until after I publish it. So if I create something and I save it as a draft, I'm not able to test it just yet. But once I've published that, it is then available for me to view. Going back into my business, or rather into my Copilot Studio home screen, and I go to flows, I will notice that all agent flows that we've created are centrally stored. And that makes it really easy for makers to find all the agent flows within an environment and then to be able to call or use them across different agents. In the old paradigm, when you were using Power Automate flows, it was possible to take a Power Automated flow that was once created from an action in an agent to then be used in another agent with another action or topic. That was absolutely possible as long as it was in the same environment. However, there wasn't an easy central way to manage or to see all of those flows that were created. Now, you could, in theory, go back into Power Automate flows and look at my flows. And in most cases, you may be able to look at the icons and kind of sort of figure out what was going on. But it is more easy, if you will, to come back in here and look in Copilot Studio and centrally track, manage, etc. And so if you are using an agent flow across 5 or 6 different agents, and you need to make a change to the agent flow, you would make it one time, and you would publish it, and then all the agents that benefit or use that flow would be benefiting from the change that you've made. So kind of centralizes that process, as it were. Now, the way you call these flows inside of an agent, again, is very simple, if you will. I can go back here in the agents page here. I've created an agent here called the Agent Flow Tester. And in Agent Flow Tester, I have created an action. Now, these agent flows can be created as actions either, or can be used as actions or from topics. So if you were creating a brand new topic, you could create one. Let's not bother populating the trigger. We could just go to add an action, and you can see the concatenate words action or agent flow shows up right over here alongside other flows that may have been created separately. Some of these were created as agent flows. Some of these are created as traditional Power Automate flows that are being called upon. Of course, you can also work with actions, etc. So once I have taken that agent flow and put it into an action in my agent, I can call this as well. So this is a reference to the action itself that I have over here. Now, for those of you who do not know or do not remember, there are some differences when you use a Power Automate flow or any other kind of Power Platform connector, etc., in the different areas of Copilot Studio. So if I were using a flow or now an agent flow in actions, I have the ability to dynamically populate or dynamically slot fill the various inputs that are out there. So it can slot fill my word 1 input and my word 2 input without me having to create a question or some other kind of variable to hold that information. In topics, it is a little more manual. You would have to either collect that information through an adaptive card or through questions, etc. And you would store that value inside of a variable, and then that variable will be passed in as an input for calling the agent flow or the Power Automate flow. But in actions, it's more dynamic. So here what we've done is inputs are left as they are. Just the user's entire response is going to be used to slot fill word 1 and word 2. And then in the outputs, the only other thing I had to do manually here was in the choose how this action would be displayed, I did tell it to display a message immediately after running this action, because it just has concatenated the words. It wouldn't really display anything unless I tell it to specifically display something or display whatever is in the output. So with this, we can go in and run a very quick test. So I'm in my test your agent screen here. I haven't deployed my agent, so let's just test it over here. And let's call concatenate words. Now, because I've got my generative AI orchestration, it should start prompting me for the things that should automatically find the right action, and then should start prompting me for the things I need. So I'm going to call it something. It actually asks for word 2 first and then word 1 later. And then I'm going to call this anything. So it should now concatenate those two, and says concatenated result is anything something. So this is just my agent flow being called. It runs through the things it needs to run, and then my agent itself taking and generatively creating an answer around the output value that was created. So it's very simple. The implementation of agent flows is really not that difficult. So this really brings us to the question of why use agent flows over Power Automate flows. So one thing I've already talked about is that agent flows being more centralized and living inside Copilot Studio makes them more accessible, easier to find, easier to manage. It's all in one place. You're not having to maintain Copilot Studio separately and Power Automate flows. As a byproduct, though, it is important to note that anything that you create over here in Copilot Studio or over there in Copilot Studio will automatically show up as a flow in Power Automate too. So it is not necessarily doing away with Power Automate. It is just presenting everything to you in Copilot Studio while the information still lives in Power Automate. And if I were to pull this particular flow up, I can see that this is created under the Copilot Studio plan. Now, going back, why one versus the other? So one reason I think Copilot Studio Pro for it is that it's an elegant implementation. One reason why you may want to do it in Power Automate Flow still, or use Power Automate Flow still, is because of the billing. So things created with Copilot Studio will use the Copilot Studio plan and have those consumption message rates that I talked about earlier. But if you're already paying for Power Automate Premium, and which by itself can be quite useful. I know a lot of people who have the Power Automate Premium license because it gives them a combination of the ability to create a lot of cloud flows and also gives them 5,000 AI Builder service credits, which can be used for all kinds of cool things that you do with AI Builder, not just within the Copilot Studio, so not just within Power Automate, but also in Copilot Studio. So those are some things that could be very valuable as well. So think about some of those, or especially AI Builder things that are called from within Power Automate flows. Let me put it that way. So you might find that you're already paying for this. Why also pay for with message consumption rates? So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer. It's really down to how you are currently licensing things and how you want it to, or how you want those costs to be run or calculated. So that is one thing to consider. As I was preparing for this video and exploring the agent flow functionality, I actually came across something that I thought was not possible before. And some of my other friends that work in Copilot Studio, when I had asked them, they too thought it was not possible. So what I'm talking about is the ability for you to create a flow first in Power Automate and then see that in Copilot Studio. As it stands, whenever you would go into Copilot Studio and you would initiate a Power Automate flow from an action or a topic, it would create that flow in Power Automate, and those flows would typically be earmarked with something like this. So let's go back and look at one of these. They would be earmarked first with the solution, a solution called Common Data Services default solution, although it was still running under the user who runs the flow plan. I found that when I was creating my own flows, any kind of flow that I was creating manually in Power Automate, those would actually not belong to any solution. And as I was reading through the documentation, I noticed that they had a section in this new Agent Flows overview that you could convert a Power Automate flow, an existing Power Automate flow, to an agent flow. And the steps that they described is that I must first put my Power Automate flow into a solution. So my quest started with which solution should I put it in? And as I found with some of the other ones that were created through Copilot Studio first, that they belong to a solution called the Common Data Service or the Common Data Solution. So let's wait for this to pop up on my screen really quick. It was the Common Data Service Solution. And what you would do is come over here and then go to Add Existing, Automation, Cloudflow, and this should let you pick the Power Automate flow that you've created and put this into this particular solution. So that is step one. And what I've noticed, by the way, as I was doing this, at least at the time of this video's making, creating a new Power Automate flow and saving it or testing it and then coming here, you would find that that new Power Automate flow was not immediately showing in this list. But give it about 20 to 30 minutes and then it would start showing up in this particular list. And so then you would add that. For instance, if I wanted to add that, I could do this, click here, add it to the solution. The next step that I have to do with my flow is I would have to go and put it from, or change it from the prevailing plan and instead drop it into the Copilot Studio plan. Now, the reason this is grayed out over here on my screen is I did not actually put the expense tracking BC flow into the Common Data Services default solution. If I had, then I would be able to select the Copilot Studio plan. I do want you to know that this is a one-way step. Once you put something into the Copilot Studio plan, you cannot take this flow back to a different plan. So think about that before you make that change. Maybe a better idea for you to copy a flow and put that in the Copilot Studio plan and disable that original flow if you no longer intend to use it. Because if at some point you decide to go back to that other one, you can disable the Copilot Studio plan from inside of Agent Flows, delete it if you need to, and then re-enable the original plan that you created under Power Automate under the old plan that you had. So that is something to keep in mind. But doing that should now ultimately allow you to see it. So this is the result of a test, not that you can validate from what I'm saying here, but when I was kind of prepping and testing things around, this was an agent that I'd created, or agent flow I'd created from Copilot Studio, much like the concatenate words. And then this was a flow that I created from Power Automate and put it into a solution and then moved it to the Copilot Studio plan. One thing that you will notice with these flows, whether I look at this particular flow from Copilot Studio or from Power Automate, let's just pull it from here and let's edit it. This is designed to, of course, be triggered from Copilot Studio. The word that you're going to use as the trigger is when an agent calls a flow. So you would call this particular trigger, give it the inputs you need to. You may be interested in responding back to the agent, or the final step may actually not involve the agent at all, especially if it involves sending an email or doing something. You may not actually want to respond back to the agent. Although I think it is a good practice, no matter what it is you're doing, it's probably a good practice to send something back to the agent, that some kind of a message or a note that the generative AI can use to respond back to the user to tell them that it's been completed and that some sort of output has been has been received from the flow that ran. So it can, in the user's mind, if you will, it will close the loop. So that is the functionality. I hope you're going to have a chance to check it out. Agent flows, I am quite confident, are already in general availability. So whether you are in a preview environment like I am over here, or you are in a standard environment in Copilot Studio, you should be able to test them out. Look forward to hearing your thoughts and your opinions. So in the comment section down below, feel free to ask questions or tell me what you think. Is this something you think is going to add a lot of value? Or do you think this is more of a housekeeping improvement? And if you haven't already subscribed, please take a moment to subscribe to OnlyCopilotFans. And of course, don't forget to like this video. And I'll see you in the next one.